person by the recently deceased. With permission from the big head, I was able to sit down and proceed. I took the security precautions and paid the fee. It took the Shadow Web admin 2 days to send the email allowing me access. In the email, they prompted me to join as many as 4 live sessions that were going on throughout the week. One of them was called Shark Bait, another was called Shit Cereal, and the other 2 are too gross to mention. The Shadow Web entrance that I was given was a portal to about 10 other websites through the Shadow Web. The websites didn't have names. They were named by numbers in a 1 through 10 list. There were about 100 other websites on the bottom, but mainly were all under construction. On the main page, it showed the times and dates of the 4 shows that they would be broadcasting live on the Shadow Web through a stream. There were archives that began in March of 2015 and ended in August. These archives were of previous live streams that had already happened. I decided to take a look. The one that I chose was called Salted Snail. I did not really know what to expect before clicking it. Judging by the name, I thought there had to be a snail involved. There wasn't. I clicked the link, and it took me to a brown page with an ad, and the video behind the ad. The ad started with a clown laughing. He then says, "Not so fast! You have to go through me before you can see what you came to see." He reminded me of Captain Spaulding. He had severed heads in the background. His face was painted and smeared. His clothes were splattered with bloodstains. In the ad, he encouraged viewers to come join one of the next sessions coming up and to pay the fee to see the fun unfold. He mentioned that the viewers were in charge and that they took control of what happened to the victims. He then looked closely into the camera and said, "It's going to be one hell of a show," and the ad ends. The video is now available to play. Once I start it, there's no credits. It just begins. You see the clown again, walking out from behind a white curtain that has what looked like a shit ton of old blood smeared all over it, with a light behind it. His face is painted, and he is naked. He walks out of the curtain, chuckling to himself and smiling, scratching his ass and balls. Then he walks towards the camera and shakes his penis in front of the camera and announces how happy he is to see the new members. He then goes on a 30-second rant about law enforcement, how they can't catch him, how he lives in the United States, and how he lives next door to a state trooper and they still can't catch him, thanking all of his friends in China. I'm guessing hackers who keep him anonymous. After his rant, he then says the show is scheduled to stream for 15 minutes, so he has to stick to schedule because he is very hungry and hasn't eaten in the past 2 days. He then flashes his ribs at the camera. He wasn't that skinny. He then asks everyone watching if they are ready for the show. A lot of people respond in the side chat box, "Yes!" He reminds everyone that he is in control of this show, not the viewers. He then chuckles and says, "I'll be right back." He goes behind the curtain, then rolls out a black barrel and places it in front of the camera. He then walks around the barrel, knocking all around it with his fists, as if knocking on a door. Then he kicks it hard with his heel, and you can hear something in the barrel. He grabs what seems like a flathead screwdriver and pries open the barrel. You can see a head full of hair as the lid opens. A girl, sitting there, alive. He then yells at her in Chinese to stand up. She can barely stand. Her body is so soggy from what I assume was water that she was being stored in. He then looks at the camera and says, "Doesn't she look delicious? As delicious as a cake." The girl had her hands tied behind her back, and her mouth was bound with multiple layers of cloth. She looked too weak to scream, too weak to escape, or even attempt. She just stood there, as if accepting death. Then the clown went behind the curtain, and came back out with a knife and a razor. He then got in front of the camera and said, "I love me some Chinese food. It's dinner time." The girl turned to him and looked at him, and he nodded at her and said, "Yes, yes, it's time." Her eyes opened wide. She tried to scream, but couldn't. He then teased her, poking at her with the knife. She began to bleed instantly from the poking. She was extremely soggy. He showed off the little razor blade and proceeded to cut little squares on her shoulder, as if cutting a cake piece. Pretty soon, he was on the other shoulder, then her chest, breast, and stomach. The scene was extremely gorish and violent, almost as if filleting a fish. By the time he was finished with her body, he had a plate filled with her skin and tissues. Somehow the girl was still alive, and her body looked like it had been eaten by piranhas. The only thing remaining were her breasts, her face, and her hair. He then took the plate behind the curtain and brought back out another plate. He looked at the camera and says, "Well, look at that. Doesn't she look great? I guess you could say she may have lost a few pounds, huh?" He then winks at the camera and laughs. He proceeds to cut off the girl's ears and lips. What looks now like a mutilated body that is still alive left me wondering what he had done to people in the past. I was enraged and extremely disturbed by what I had seen. The finale showed the clown coming out of the curtain with 2 containers of salt. He poured the salt all over the girl's body where the skin had been cut off, making sure to get her lips and ears too. The girl was suffering, hardly moving, but somehow still alive. He then looks at the camera and says, "I bet you motherfuckers thought I was gonna kill her, didn't you? I'm not a murderer." He then pushes her head back down into the barrel and closes the lid. He looks at the camera and says, "Stay tuned for the next episode." The camera then shows him putting a white tablecloth over the barrel and placing the plate full of soggy flesh on the barrel. And it shows him light a candle, grab a fork and a knife, and pull up a chair. The camera continues rolling as he's sitting there eating the flesh, laughing away, and talking to himself. The screen then floods with the words, "Till the next episode," over and over and over, with some circus music playing in the background. The camera then dims as it shows him there, eating and laughing away. Then the screen goes black and shows the words, "Offline." The clown clearly looked American, or sounded American at least. He really resembled Captain Spaulding from The Devil's Rejects or House of a Thousand Corpses. I'm assuming that is what he was trying to act like. I contacted my chief and had a personal meeting with him and explained everything about what I had seen. He then laughed and said, "Ah, you have seen him, huh? That evil fucking clown on the internet. He has been around since the late 90s, doing these shows. He seems to buy women off the market and then tortures the shit out of them." He then shrugs his shoulders and says, "We don't know who he is or where he is located. The Chinese help him stay anonymous." This was something new to me. As an agent who dealt with homicide and piracy, I had never encountered nor seen anything like this. I am now retired and thought I would share this story in hopes to get the word out. Everyone should know the deep web is deep and free, but the shadow web, that is something you don't want to go to. I can't disclose much information, but I work for the UK government. I was assigned to track down several missing people who were spotted on what was known as the deep web. I had briefly heard of this place before, but some research was required before I went in. It was a place where criminals can be safe. Contract killers, live stream murderers, child pornographers, the darkest depths of the internet. I fired up my PC and downloaded the Tor browser. I installed it and had it up and running in a matter of moments. Due to my prior research, I knew the hidden wiki would lead me to find the sites that I needed. The missing people were spotted on a live stream torture site. This is where I started. So many horrific acts. I saw one where someone captured a homeless man, and the director was commenting on what they wanted done to him. He had already had his eyes gouged out, his face cut up, and he was being skinned alive. I had to continue on with my search. I was looking for a white male, brown hair, blue eyes, around 6 foot and 195 pounds. This was not going to be a pleasant experience. I counted 23 people, if not more, being tortured, raped, mutilated, and brutally murdered in front of the camera, until I found one which stood out. A white male, brown hair, around 6 foot, and he looked about 195 pounds. I had to endure watching him being tortured and killed for 47 painful and horrendous minutes. After the murder, something even worse happened. I saw that the murderer cut open his chest and spread his ribs and lungs out like a bird. I'd seen this before. It's called the Blood Eagle. The Blood Eagle was once used to kill a king who had killed someone's father. Originated in Nordic civilizations. The details weren't important now. What was important was the fact that the Blood Eagle cult could be back. A group of contract killers who operated anywhere and everywhere, always sacrificing people to the Eagle, which they called God. Someone had to put a stop to this. I didn't have the resources or the training to take down a criminal organization by myself. I didn't even have any solid evidence to take to my superiors. No proof of the Blood Eagles even existing. Just one sick and twisted video I found on the internet. I needed a break to return to normality. I closed down the browser after exiting the site. Something was very wrong. My desktop background. It wasn't the picture I cherished of me graduating from Sandhurst with my proud uniform and family. It was something that would forever change me. A picture of a corpse with its ribs spread open and his lungs on display. A blood eagle. I couldn't take it anymore. I gasped and powered down the computer. A virus? It must be. Used to scare the sickos who watch those things. I ran out of my office, but I heard my computer whirring into life. Dashing back into the room, I stared in horror at the monitor. No blood, no gore, just some words. My name, then the words, "The eye of the eagle sees all." How did they remotely turn on my computer? How the fuck did they know my name? I ran outside, grabbing my keys, wallet, phone, etc. I quickly took a breath of fresh air and walked. I just walked for a while. In the real world. It was just a computer virus, right? Wrong. I couldn't be out too long. My wife would be coming home from work. She can wait. I was scared. For once, I was truly scared. Terrified, you could say. I found myself sitting on a bench, talking to a nice old man about the weather and woodworking tips and other hobbies. I forgot about everything that had happened until I went home. My door was unlocked and a tad open. Strange. Jenny, my wife, always keeps the doors locked. I opened the door and bellowed upstairs. "Sorry, love. I took a walk. Needed a breather." I ran upstairs to see her. Not noticing the blood on the walls, I opened the bedroom door. The whole room was red, soaked with blood. What I can only hope wasn't Jenny's face was slashed up beyond all recognition, and her throat was slit multiple times. I've seen dead before, but nothing close to this. I stared in horror. The wings. Her lungs spread out over her ribs. The blood eagle. What the fuck? How the fuck? My flood of anger and fear and overwhelming misery was interrupted by a voice. It said my name, although heavily distorted. It came from my office. It came from my computer. I saw the face of a black and white mask, yet still slightly pixelated. I screamed, "What have you done? Where are you? What the fuck are you?" He replied with, "We are the Blood Eagle. We kill as he wishes. Do not stop us. Do not try. Do not search us, or you and your closest family will suffer. The eagle sees all and can do terrible things." I was speechless and feeling like I brought this upon her. I wanted nothing to do with this anymore, and I made a decision. I called the police, and I told them what happened. They investigated and said it was a suicide. I couldn't believe it. Weeks passed, and I was still haunted by the event. I eventually booked a flight to Canada, where we had a nice little log cabin. I packed almost everything I had: my trusty shotgun, clothes, and all my cash in Canadian dollars. I left my life behind, even quitting my job. I never want to go back to the deep web, or even hear anything about it. now I keep to myself and live a relatively simple life. Therapy helped me recover. I'm happy now. Well, somewhat. Years have passed, and I finally feel safe. Almost. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe so you can catch all of my future content. Today's video, I actually wanted to hear from you guys and hear if you thought these were true stories or not. That's why I didn't label these as true. They claim to be true by the original posters, but some of them seem a little out there. But I've also never personally been on the deep web. So let me know down below if maybe you have an experience that might justify these. I have another story like this lined up for tomorrow. My name is Chris, and here are some facts about me. I just got out of a 5-hour police interrogation, and I am never using Craigslist again. And I am now afraid to leave my house because I don't want to die. I will try to keep it brief, but we should start at the beginning. My new apartment only has my bed and my laptop in it. Otherwise, it's completely empty. I am embarrassed by that, so I don't have people over. Kinko's pays me very little, so I check Craigslist every few hours and hope to luck out with curb alerts. I was skeptical at first, but I picked up a couch and then a table a day or two later. I am really happy to fill in some of the space, even if it is with an old lady's couch. Brandon drives a big F-250 truck, so I negotiated to feed him if he helps me grab furniture and haul it to my place. I don't bug him that much, and we go way back, so he agreed to help. I felt even more grateful because he is a bigger guy, and we can lift whatever we need to into the truck. So this morning I browsed the free stuff category when I see a picture of a comfy-looking recliner. The post says it has just been steam cleaned. I have always wanted a lazy boy, so I reply that someone has picked it up and call Brandon immediately. It's his day off, so he books it to my place as I put the address in my phone. We were hunting it down inside of 5 minutes. We arrived in record time, blowing right through the residential streets and heading towards the warehouse district. I figured someone was cleaning out their storage. The chair stood on a corner by some abandoned-looking buildings. We hopped out, and I started sizing it up, while Brandon put down the back of the truck. It smelled like it had just been cleaned, and it was enormous. About halfway through lifting it, a bright flash went off from one of the cracked windows in the dilapidated building. Brandon and I shared a concerned look and chucked the chair into the back as fast as we could. I was a little spooked, and we sped off without securing the chair. Once we got out of there, we joked about getting killed in an alley, and I asked Brandon what he wanted to eat for lunch. He said IHOP, and that sounded great to me. So we drove to get some hash browns and waffles. Entering the parking lot, this hippie-looking bicyclist shot out in front of us. I tensed up, but luckily we were only doing about 15 miles per hour, and Brandon stomped on the brakes. The tires screeched, and the momentum ended up tossing the chair out of the truck and onto the pavement. I was in shock for a second, and then started to get angry. It must have shown, because the biker took off as soon as he saw our faces. I got out to survey the damage. I had heard a loud crack when the chair hit the ground. The recliner was broken. The pavement had snapped the wooden frame on impact. I was pissed. We started manhandling the now broken and hard-to-carry chair back into the truck. I threw it in disgusted, and that is when I saw an envelope in the recliner under the chair. It was a normal-looking manila thing, about the size of a piece of paper. I grabbed it and walked to the door while Brandon parked. As Brandon walked up, he offered to pay for his own food because I had gotten robbed. But he had shown up to help, so I insisted. A cute waitress wearing a name tag that said Liz sat us at a far table. Liz said, "I hope you guys are okay. What happened?" Brandon said, "Idiot ran right out in front of us. He's lucky we didn't hit him." I said, "Nothing like a near-death experience to make you want some hash browns." Liz said, "Yeah, I'm glad no one got hurt. Are you ready to order?" We ordered our food, and Liz was being playful. Brandon took this as his cue. Brandon said, "When do you get off? You want to go do something later?" Liz blushed. I said, "Sorry about him. He is an animal. I can't take him anywhere." Brandon shrugged and howled like a wolf jokingly. Liz walked off towards the kitchen laughing. Brandon and I joked for a few minutes, and he revealed that he was in love with our current food provider and fully intended on arranging a marriage. I offered the broken chair as a dowry and grabbed our newfound hidden treasure. The envelope didn't have any writing on it, so I pulled the metal prongs together in order to open the flap. I said, "Here's hoping." I dumped the contents out on the table. I frowned and saw Brandon had a matching frown. 4 Polaroids and a black box the size of a Haida key laid there. As Liz came back with our plates, Brandon smiled at her, and I flipped the pictures over. Liz said, "You boys have a nice lunch." Brandon said, "Maybe I can get you a nice dinner sometime." Liz nodded like she was busy and hurried off. I said, "Scared off the waitress." I shook my head, and Brandon dug into his food. The pictures showed 4 different people. All of them were tied to the recliner with tape over their mouths, wide-eyed and covered in tears. Nope, nope, nope. I dropped the pictures and scooted away from them in the bench seat. Brandon picked them up and looked at them for a second before going wide-eyed himself. His voice got really low, and he slid them back towards me. Brandon said, "Chris, dude, these are all in different rooms." The black box thing only had a little watch battery compartment. I didn't want to break it, so I was going to wait to unscrew it when I got home. That is when the police car pulled into the parking lot. 2 officers walked in, and Liz nodded for a second and pointed at us. Hands on their guns, they asked us to step away from the table and lay on the floor. We immediately put our hands up and laid down on the filthy diner floor. IHOP floor smelled terrible, if you have ever wondered. The police handcuffed us and took us out to the curb outside, while the bigger of the 2 rambled off Miranda rights. The first cop, with the badge that said "Friendly," started in on us. Officer Friendly said, "Why do you have pictures of tied up people?" I said, "We found them in the chair in the truck. We just picked up the chair." Officer Friendly replied, "Where did you get the chair?" Brandon said, "We saw it on Craigslist. It was over by the old paper mill." Officer Friendly said, "And you 2 just took it?" I said, "It was a curb alert for a free chair. I needed a chair." Officer Friendly turned and started talking into his shoulder radio. Officer Valdez walked out of the IHOP shaking his head. He looked at us sharply, then said, "You like picking on waitresses?" I said, "We didn't, as far as I know." Officer Valdez said, "You didn't say a bunch of stuff about hitting people, death, and how you were animals? You didn't howl at her like a wolf?" Brandon said, "That is way out of context. We were joking, dude." Officer Valdez narrowed his eyes, and then said, "Do I look like one of your pals, dude? It is officer." They grilled us about the chair and the pictures a few more times. I tried to pull up the Craigslist post on my phone, but whoever posted it had removed it. A big white and blue forensic van rolled into the parking lot after a few minutes. 2 men holding little black briefcases got out. One sprayed the chair with something, and the other got out what looked like a black light. The chair glowed in weird splotchy patterns. As soon as that happened, we got shoved into the back of a police cruiser and taken to the police station a few blocks away. The cops got a little rougher then. I got shoved into a tiny room and handcuffed to a table. It stunk like piss and couldn't have been bigger than about 6 feet. I don't know how long I was in there. It felt like forever, with just a tiny window on the door and that weird wire stuff in the glass that makes the diamond pattern. Finally, a balding older guy walked in. He had a friendly face. He sat down and looked at me for a while. The guy said, "I'm Detective Bradley. I have been assigned to the missing person case involved with this. Let's start from the top." I told the detective the entire story. He took notes the entire time without showing any emotion. Then he walked out without another word. I sat in the room sweating and panicking for 30 minutes before he returned. He strode back in, sat down, and looked at me again. Detective Bradley said, "Okay, your friend just told me what really happened, so let's start over from the beginning again." What the hell did Brandon say? I went into the entire story again. By the end, I was exhausted. Detective Bradley said, "Where are your friends?" I said, "I don't know where they put Brandon." Then he said, "The other two." I said, "I have no clue what you were talking about." Detective Bradley replied, "I have 2 guys holding a picture of my missing person tied to a chair, the bloody chair, and a box with 4 sets of prints found, none matching my guy. Where are the other 2 people?" I said, "I have no idea. They probably left the chair." At this point, it developed into even more back and forth and retelling the story a few more times. I was angry and scared, and I was ready to lose it. I had an idea and asked for a lawyer. That made Detective Bradley really angry, but he walked outside, and I assume he got me one. A little after, he returned with someone knocking on the door and waved through the tiny reinforced window. The detective and the guy talked for a minute before he returned to his seat. The cop replied, "The radio beacon you had on the table. What is it for?" I said, "There was a tracking beacon in the chair?" The cop said, "Don't play stupid." I said, "I almost took that home." I think me freaking out made it click together for the cop. He cooled off a little and started asking me if I saw anything while picking up the chair, or if I could remember anything about the post. I told him what I could, until my lawyer showed up. He demanded I be released, and then got Brandon out too. Detective Bradley stopped me on the way out though, and said, "I'm not sure you were telling the truth. I'm going to keep looking. But do you think that flash could have been from a camera?" I said, "What flash?" Detective Bradley said, "The flash, when you picked up the chair. Do you have any place to go that you aren't alone?" I paused for a second. Whoever did this knows what I look like, and I broke the chair and caused the investigation. Luckily, the flash came from the opposite direction of the license plate. Brandon decided to sleep over at my place, but even getting home, we were eyeing everyone, and every set of headlights had us both peeking through the blinds. I guess you get what you pay for. That is the first part of the story. This next part is an update that they wrote. There is so much to tell. I am also on a good bit of pharmaceutical-grade morphine. Brennan and I were stuck in a state of fear, barely sleeping and barricaded in my apartment. Even the tiniest noise caused us both to grab improvised weapons. We barely talked, but when we did, it would push us both deeper into uneasiness because all we had to say was that we were terrified. The headlights at night were the worst. I would tense up as they passed across the window, thinking I was going to die each and every time. I called the police station 4 times about suspicious behavior. They only came the first 2, though. The second time, I had gotten my downstairs neighbor in trouble. He came home late and was charged with having an open container of alcohol in his car. Luckily, they didn't arrest him because he was already at home. 3 days of constant terror passed before we started to unwind a little bit. The police said it was probably a sick joke that went too far the last time I called. I think we both wanted to believe that. It felt so horrible that we didn't want it to be real anyway. We had run out of food completely at this point, which was a big problem because I am a bachelor in a new place, so we started with barely any. So by then, we were literally starving. You can only stretch a box of ramen noodles and some leftovers so far. Brandon said, "I'm going to make a supply run to Publix." I shook my head at him and said, "I don't think that's a good idea, man." Brandon ignored me and grabbed his keys. I remember thinking he was trying to convince himself it was okay. I put up a hand and tried to say something. Brandon shot through the door. "Back in 30 minutes. It will be okay." He finished the sentence as the door was closing. That was the last time I saw him alive. I waited for 5 hours and he never returned. I couldn't take not knowing anymore, and he wasn't answering his phone, so I called the police. They recognized the number and said to give it until tomorrow. That night was the scariest night I have had in a long time. The shadows even seemed to stretch towards me. Everything was a threat. I was sitting with everything off in the pitch black so it wouldn't look like I was home. I had already moved my car to the visitors section so Brandon could pick me up and help haul the chair, so the apartment space was empty. In the darkness, all I could hear were bumps that in my mind were people creeping in the dark after me, and my downstairs neighbor. I remember hearing him yell about the ticket in a very angry tone of voice. Downstairs guy said, "Fuck that stupid asshole! I hope he dies of AIDS." It wasn't helping my sense of safety. My anxiety intensified and I hugged my knees in a tight ball. The voice downstairs said, "I don't care if he can hear me. I hope that bitch can." I was propped up in the far corner of the living room, clutching a steak knife because it made me feel better than having nothing. I remember fading out while still being scared, just a giant heavy black curtain slowly burying me. I woke up the next morning stiff. My entire body popped as I stood up. I woke up around noon and I called the police again. The lady on the line said, "We will dispatch an officer to get a report from you. Stay at home." I replied, "I haven't left home in 5 days. My friend left home, and now I am filing a report." The lady switched tones. "I'm sorry, sir. An officer will be there shortly." I was staring at the empty fridge, and I had this feeling that I was just as hollow inside. I felt starved, scared, and carrying around this sinking feeling about Brandon. I have never wished I was a different person with a different life more than I did at that moment. Detective Bradley showed up at my door instead of a uniformed cop. That would save some time explaining at least. I recapped the last few days for him on my doorstep. Detective Bradley replied, "Okay, well, before we talk, you haven't eaten in 5 days. Will you come grab some food with me? My treat." I really didn't want to leave, and I got suspicious of the offer almost immediately. Detective Bradley said, "I can keep you safe. I have a gun and everything." I tensed up when he mentioned it. Detective Bradley said, "Oh, I get it." The detective then held up his police radio and pushed the button, then said, "This is Bradley at," and then he gave my address. "I am going to need a few minutes for the interview." Then he turned to me and said, "See, they all know I am here." I still didn't trust him, but I was starving. My resolve was starting to buckle. Detective Bradley said, "Look, you can sit up front and play with the lights." I had one of those moments where you should be terrified, but my first reaction was actually, "Ooh, lights," in my head. I felt silly and went with him. He was being nice on the ride there, not saying too much. We came to this hole-in-the-wall place named Sally's. It was a cop diner. I felt a lot better when I saw a dozen or more officers in uniform at the various tables and stools. They couldn't all be in on it. We ordered, and during the wait, Detective Bradley started talking. He said, "First, I wanted to say sorry for the scare we gave you. It looked really bad at the time." I nodded, because honestly I thought it looked bad too. Then he said, "We looked into the matter further, and there are similar cases going down the coast. We think it is a team of drifters, but nothing is confirmed, however." I was thankful when the giant omelets and French fries arrived. Detective Bradley nodded to the food while he was talking. The way I dug into that food, she may as well have brought me a shovel instead of a fork. Detective Bradley said, "I have some news that might be a little hard for you to hear about Brandon." I paused mid-bite. That sinking feeling somehow started sinking faster. I said, "What?" Detective Bradley replied, "We found his truck last night, abandoned behind the shopping center. No trace of him." I don't remember moving, but my head bouncing off the table woke me back up. Detective Bradley said, "We are searching for him now. I'm going to send a detail to your apartment for a few days though, all right?" I nodded, kind of. My bones felt like rubber. Detective Bradley said, "We are pretty sure they will keep going south now. At least that is the pattern so far, but I want to be sure." I'm not proud of it, but I numbly finished eating while I was still in shock. I hadn't had more than a bowl of ramen noodles for days, and I didn't know when I would get food next. The ride back was silent. I made eye contact once by accident and received a sympathetic look from the detective. He stayed with me for an hour. After that, he made a call to the department. None other than Officer Friendly showed up, holding a bag of groceries. He handed me the bag with a wink. Officer Friendly said, "I snuck something in the bottom for you." I said, "Thanks, that's really nice of you." He replied, "I will be right outside all night, buddy, so you just make some noise or flash the lights a few times and I will come in shooting." I nodded, and he punched me on the shoulder softly. It reminded me of an older brother a little bit. I think he felt a little guilty. He went back and sat in his car. Under the milk and cereal and the microwave meals, there was a six-pack of Miller Lite. I'm not much of a drinker, but it was a nice gesture, and I had one just to take the edge off the entire situation. I didn't remember how bad beer actually tasted until it was too late. The next couple of days, the cops rotated shifts in front of my house. The downstairs neighbor was pissed, like insanely pissed. I could hear him yelling about it all night. After the third night, there was a report about a posting that looked suspiciously like the others a little further south, so they decided the protective detail had done its job. I was so relieved. I felt bad about the other people in danger, but the selfish part of me just wanted to feel safe. That is when my situation went south, along with the cops' focus. You play all these games in your mind about what you would do in a bad situation. You make all your little plans. You think that you have it all under control, and you know what to do. Then one night, you wake up with 3 men wearing ratty ski masks standing over you, with a knife to your neck and a hand over your mouth. I felt a hand grab the back of my hair. Sharp pain shot from my scalp as the fingers tightened. I couldn't tell who grabbed me because I was still blurry and coming to terms with what was happening. I got dragged into the living room head first and pushed into my computer chair at the center of the room. It was a big executive-style computer chair, and ironically, the only thing besides my laptop I hadn't got off Craigslist. I heard that odd metallic sound of a roll of duct tape being unrolled right before my head was yanked back. I felt the tape wrapped around my mouth so hard it made the inside of my mouth bleed. As the tape wound around the headrest and attached me to the chair, I realized I could only look around by moving my eyes. My head was stuck in place. Quickly, I was bound by the wrists, shoulders, knees, and ankles with duct tape. I probably should have fought more, but I had two guys holding me at knife point, and I thought I might be able to get away when they tried to move me. I was fully awake now, and the reality of my situation was sinking in. They weren't going to move me. I tried to struggle and pull free, but the most I managed was to hop the chair a few times. The biggest of the three guys pointed the knife at me and shook his head slowly. I was panicking, and it was hard to breathe through my nose, so I started huffing really hard in order to get air. I was dizzy, and I wasn't sure why. That is when the one with the green mask, there were three, a bigger and a smaller guy in black masks as well, punched me. It wasn't a little punch either. He squared his stance and pulled all the way back, like a boxer. My face exploded in pain because I couldn't move my head. I saw the white flash when he connected behind my closed eyes and felt the vertigo as the whole chair rocked back. My cheekbone and eye pounded in pain, in sync with my heartbeat. My mouth felt like a desert full of pain with lack of spit when I realized they had definitely done this before. They felt a little too organized, and this deep feeling of despair started to wash over me. I tried to jerk out of the chair again, but the tape held me trapped. This time, the bigger guy with the hunting knife started poking me with the tip of the knife, in the arm at first, and then the chest. He was smiling as I tried to squirm away from the point. He was putting tiny holes all over me that burned as the air hit them. The worst part was, he kept acting like he was going to push it deeper, and then wouldn't. This seemed to amuse all three of the monsters. My vision blurred a little. I realized I was crying. I was starting to realize that I was really going to die in this stupid computer chair. Breathing was difficult too. My nose was starting to clog with snot. I tried to yell for help, but the tape muffled the sound so that my cry was too small to do much of anything. The smaller guy in the group walked over to me and stared me right in the eyes. His eyes were way too light, that creepy almost white blue. I couldn't look down too well, but through the numbness of the tight tape, I felt him touching my hand. He never broke his stare. My pinky exploded in pain. I couldn't move it. He slowly smiled and stepped back. My finger was definitely broken. I could see it sticking up at a 90-degree angle from my hand. It felt like it was made of lava. I say lava because of the burning plus all the pressure. It hurt so bad, I couldn't form a thought. I started bawling now, crying for my life. Every day I wasted doing nothing. Every time I was too scared to try something, they all came back to mock me in that moment. A flash snapped me out of it. The biggest guy had put his knife down on the coffee table and taken a Polaroid camera out of his bag. He shook the picture menacingly against his hand. The smallest one took another picture out of the bag and stalked over to me. He held it up in the dim room, but I couldn't make it out. When he lit his lighter, I saw Brandon, tied to a chair. He was in bad shape. He looked like he was in pain. These animals had tied him to a wooden chair in what looked like a shack with some kind of wire. He was bleeding from where he had tried to yank free. After forcing me to look at him for a long time, the three men laughed at me softly as I tried to kick and claw at them. The small one pushed the burning hot lighter against my arm and started hitting me in the face with the photo lightly. The pain was intense, and I could smell my flesh burning. But it wasn't as bad under the pain of a broken finger. I swelled with rage at that moment. I was able to force myself to not react. I stared in his eyes, promising that I would kill him someday. I swelled with rage at that moment. I was able to force myself to not react. I stared in his eyes, making a promise to myself that I would kill him someday. The other two found it more amusing than my struggling, which seemed to anger the smaller guy more. He punched me in the burn so hard I heard a crack. That snapped me back into the throes of agony, which seemed to satisfy him. He grabbed my chin and slapped me across the face as hard as he could. I felt some of my hair rip out from the tape. The entire side of my face burned. The bigger guy waved the knife through the air slowly as he walked the few steps to my kitchen. It was only separated by half a counter from the living room. He smiled under the mask as he turned the stove burner on high. This is when it clicked. They laughed at the smaller guy's attempt. This was a game, and I wasn't a player. I was just the field. I moaned then. I'm not sure if it was agony, hopelessness, or desperation, but all of the feelings overwhelmed me at once. After what seemed like an eternity, the knife came off the stove. It glowed in the darkness from the heat. It was bright red like a hot coal. He started moving slowly towards me, but kept its point focused on the same spot. Step by step, I started to feel the terror. Another step closer confirmed it. He was pointing that knife at my eye. I started trying to flail out of the chair. He took another slow step closer. You could see the delight in his face. I fought with all my strength, and I managed to stretch some of the tape, but not enough. The knife was an inch away from my eye. I couldn't stop blinking from the heat. I could barely breathe, but I was too scared to move with it that close. I shut my eyes as I saw his forearms tense so he could stab me. He waited. I think he was waiting for me to open my eyes again. I kept pushing it through my mind, but I knew if I moved, it was all over. My leg was on fire instantly. I couldn't look down, but the knife was against my inner thigh, burning me. I struggled and yelled and tried to buck. There was movement in the room, but I couldn't see it. It felt like I got hit across the face again. All I could say was, "Knife! The knife! The knife!" It hurt twice as bad coming off my leg as it did being put on my leg. I bellowed in pain, a rather shaking primal type of scream. I looked up and saw a blurry guy with a gun. As I was getting buried under that all too familiar heavy black curtain of unconsciousness, I heard a voice. Officer Friendly said, "Jesus! Were they gonna burn his dick off?" I woke up to the sound of beeps and the smell of bleach. I was warm and fuzzy all over. I think the IV in my arm had something to do with it. Officer Friendly said, "Hey, you up?" I said, "You saved my dick." I realized what I had said, and that seemed hilarious to me at the time, so when he started laughing, I joined him. We laughed for a couple of minutes. My arm was in a cast, my finger in a splint. I had patches on my face and my leg. Bruises in different yellows and purples seemed to be all over me. I said, "Thank you." Officer Friendly replied, "They have you all patched up, but they need to do some tests. You need anything from home?" I nodded yes, as I started to get up to pee. Officer Friendly said, "You need to go to the bathroom?" I replied, "I think I got it. I'll let you know." I managed to get into the bathroom without too much trouble. Half of my face was deep purple, and the eye on that side of the face had filled with blood. I looked like a B-movie monster. I felt like I should have been more red. "Oh, that's nice of them. You don't smoke, do you?" He wheeled me out front by the cop car. Then he bummed a cigarette off a lady who was sitting there. He came back and handed it to me lit. Officer Friendly said, "Your neighbor called in a noise complaint and said you were having a party. Me and Valdez knew that didn't sound right. So we took the call and saw the nondescript bad guy van. Then we peeked through the window blinds. I said, "Yeah, that guy said he wants me to die of AIDS." My tone was pretty matter-of-fact about it. I was still a little stoned. Officer Friendly replied, "Well, he accidentally saved your life then." I started laughing a little, and then said, "You said make some noise. I would have flicked the light, but I was a little tied up." Officer Friendly showed back up 5 minutes early. He had my laptop bag, a McDonald's bag, and another plastic bag. He handed me all three. The McDonald's bag had a Big Mac and a large fry, and the other bag had 2 packs of Marlboro Reds and a lighter. I ate the Big Mac in about 3 bites and started shoving fries into my mouth. I then realized I hadn't said thank you. "Okay, man, I will stop back by tomorrow. Are you good to get back in your room?" I had finished swallowing and replied, "Yeah, thank you so much for this." He replied, "No problem. You heal up. I will see you tomorrow." I offered the lady some French fries. She ate some with me. "Sure, now I am your best buddy." I had one last cigarette before heading back up to my room. I had to ask the lady at the counter where it was. My laptop was dead, so while it was charging, I had been sitting back trying to reflect on what happened and sort it all out. Trying to type this all with a broken pinky is challenging. I am still hoping that Brandon made it. Part of me thinks he probably didn't, but I don't know that he didn't. There aren't any reporters or anything. I would think that there would be, but no one is bugging me so far. I was debating on moving, but there is a certain comfort in knowing that every day in the apartment is never going to be the worst day anymore. If you enjoyed this video, you know what to do. So this story, the author says it's 100% true. I did read through the comments, and I'll have a link in the description if you would like to go read through them as well. People did point out some of the holes, but he did explain them as well. There was a couple holes that I thought about as well, such as a chair flying out of the back of a truck going 15 miles an hour, but it could have just been a big chair, and maybe the walls of the truck bed weren't that big. Who knows? So, we can either completely believe him or not, but he's pretty damn detailed, and either way, this is a scary, scary story. And it really makes you wonder what people are capable of. You never know if someone's actually going to try to do this, because realistically, it's a pretty good setup. Get some random person to come pick something up, now you have a tracking device, you can do whatever you want. They did get fortunate at the IHOP though, that the waitress saw the pictures and didn't say anything, just called the police. I think that actually worked to their advantage, even though at the time it seemed like a disadvantage. I think it really saved his life. I really hope they're able to give him some closure with his friend Brandon, as well as notify Brandon's family, even though none of these are their real names. Obviously. I've never met an officer with his name Officer Friendly, although that would be awesome, I think. Let me know down below what you thought of the story. Regardless, I think it'll still give a lot of you the chills. I'll see you guys tomorrow for another video. And just remember, it's always scarier if it's true. When I went home for 3 weeks about a month and a half ago, my dad decided that we should do a bit of night fishing. I'm not a huge fan of night fishing, any sort of fishing, or my dad for that matter. Our personalities are way too similar, and if you leave us together for more than an hour, there may be blood left over by the time he and I are done playing several dozen rounds of fistcuffs between the stubborn arguing and shouting. Dad decided to take me to this river by our new house that they had just finished building. My mom and brother stayed behind as we traipsed through the dark woods. My family lives in Oregon, and the river's about 1.5 miles from mine and my family's property,
over massive fallen trees and stumps that I easily trip on, not knowing the lay of the land. My dad merely scoffed at me and reminded me that the city living makes you soft. He didn't say it like that, but something along those lines, like the stereotypical cowboy out of those old Wild West films. I blamed the fact that I didn't know the area as well as he did, and it just spiraled downhill from there, and arguing broke out between us, making the peaceful night loud and chaotic. We didn't stop arguing the entire way down to the river, my father critiquing my less than Christian lifestyle, while I criticized his manner of parenting with my 20-year-old autistic brother. When we got down to the river, we finally settled down into an awkward, tense silence as we got our gear out. I knew that this fight was far from over as I sat down on a fallen stump and shivered my ass off. I had lived in a warm climate for over a year, and honestly, coming out here was probably him punishing me for even leaving the Pacific Northwest. We refused to talk to one another as our lights danced across the water, when my dad suddenly stood up, his light landing on the other side of the river. There, on the other bank stood a man staring right at us. He wore a bright orange tee and a pair of scraggly jeans, but for the most part looked pretty average, if you didn't count the machete hanging from his belt. My dad snapped at me to start packing all our stuff up, so I followed his command as my dad started shouting at the man across the river. Their conversation was mostly lost to the roar of the white-capped water, but I could see the man making agitated sweeps with his hands every time I dared to peek. Their voices grew and my fear grew with it. My father has never been one to carry protection in the woods, hence why I was born. This man was armed and possibly dangerous with that machete, and while we had the river between us, it was shallow and had plenty of places to cross, and even if it was snow runoff, I had no doubt that this man could get behind us in mere minutes. Had we wandered onto his property by mistake and not even known it? "Drop the gear and let's go," my dad snarled at me as I took one last look to see the man starting to walk into the water, his hand flitting against his weapon. My dad put a firm hand on my shoulder and led me back into the woods towards our house. My dad is an ultra-marathoner. He runs like it's going out of style, and my mostly out-of-shape self probably wouldn't have kept up if I hadn't been so terrified. I couldn't hear if the man was coming after us, my heartbeat being so loud in my ears, but I followed my dad so closely I almost ran into him several times. Finally, we found our road and made a break for my parents' house. As soon as we were through the front door, my dad had the doors locked and was keeping a vigilant watch out the windows, making sure no crazy men with machete were creeping up on our house. Finally, when we figured that there were no guys wearing orange t-shirts, we sat down and began to talk about our experience with my mom. We avoided the part where we had been arguing, but told her everything else. We went to bed without apologizing, and I honestly felt horrid. The next day, with the only gun he owned, my father and I walked back into the woods after calling the police. They said that there was a guy who did enjoy scaring people off the forest land in the area, and that we shouldn't be too concerned. Feeling a bit sheepish, we went back to the place where we had left our gear, both of us apologizing for our lackluster behavior the night before. When we returned to what we believed to be the spot, we saw that the fishing poles had been bent, and all the line had been draped from tree to tree, and the tackle box was gone. However, me and my dad didn't fight again for the rest of my trip home. I would say this happened roughly 4 years ago. Myself and 2 friends used to have LAN parties a few times each year, where we would play video games, watch movies, and eat pizza all weekend. My friend Joe lived in a cozy suburban neighborhood. His dad worked abroad in Norway, worked 3 weeks and then came home too. His mom worked a night at the local hospital, and his sister usually stayed over at a friend's house when we had the LAN, so we had the whole house to ourselves. Around 10 p.m., after a few hours of gaming, my 2 friends head downstairs to heat up some pizza leftovers. I said I would join them shortly once I was done playing Skyrim. Suddenly the doorbell starts ringing downstairs over and over, and I get really annoyed, thinking that they were winding me up, so I ignored it. After about 20 seconds of the constant ringing, I head downstairs really annoyed, asking them what they're doing. I look out the little round window at the door and I see a man in his mid-30s with a creepy mustache, smiling and looking directly at me. I just froze. I back out and head into the kitchen where my friends are standing very still. I ask them what's going on, and Joe says that it's his neighbor Jack, who is a close friend to the family with a wife and 2 young daughters. Joe says for the last couple of months he had started taking his medications, so he was in a very fragile mood, so we should try to ignore him. The bell keeps ringing in the background, so Joe starts heading to the door to calm him down, with me and my other friend following. Joe asks what's up, and actually starts to open the door. At this point, I'm getting really worried. But to my surprise, Jack blocks the door so Joe can't open it, and started yelling, "I want Joe! I want Joe!" So Joe, fearing that he might get violent, locks the door and we start freaking out, so he goes away. We head back to the kitchen talking, just keeping ourselves calm, and it's quiet for a minute. I turn around and I see Jack once again, this time on the porch with his hands on the glass. And I'll tell you, I don't think I've ever been this shocked. He started banging really hard on the glass, so we ran upstairs to look for something to defend ourselves with in case he breaks down the glass. Me and Joe were in the zombie apocalypse phase at the time, so we had a lot of homemade weapons such as nailed baseball bats, etc. I actually started dialing 112, the equivalent to 911, because I thought that this had gotten way out of hand for us. But Joe stopped me from doing so. He was afraid that the police might come and arrest the guy, which would have destroyed his career and torn his family apart. So I put the phone away, and all 3 of us with knives and baseball bats blocked the stairs. We said to each other that if he came in, we would defend ourselves if necessary. But to my relief, the banging stopped and we didn't hear from Jack again that night. When Joe's mom came home from work, we told her about it. I don't know if she talked to him the day after, but I hope she did, because that could have turned out way worse than it did. His sister might have been there all alone. I don't have anything that can prove this actually happened, such as police reports, since we chose not to call it in, so I hope you can trust me on this. The story takes place back in October of 2011. It was a Saturday morning, and I had just woken up. I did the usual routine of eating breakfast and making myself some coffee to go. I worked at a local Jack's in the northwest part of Alabama at this time, and was scheduled to work from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. that day. I grabbed my keys, walked outside with my coffee, started up my car, and began my drive to work. Work is about 10 minutes away from my house. But on the way over, I have to drive through about 5 minutes of woods and go past a sketchy neighborhood. I had cleared most of the woods and was beginning to drive past the sketchy neighborhood. I looked up ahead and saw a woman who was walking her husky down the road. As I approached to pass her, she turned her head to me and just stared at me with a blank, lifeless face, and continued to do so until I went over a small hill, not too far from her, that put me out of her sight. I knew this woman. Not personally, but had seen her many times for the past few months. One of my friends from middle school lived not too far from this sketchy neighborhood, and commonly saw her. He said all she would do is stare at him with that same lifeless face. My friend recalled that one time she picked up a rock and threw it at him when he approached her one day to pet her dog and introduce himself. This woman clearly had some mental issues. I arrived at work and did my normal duties of frying chicken and cleaning the dishes. After a long day, 6 p.m. finally got here. I clocked out, got in my car, and headed back in the direction of my home where I had dinner waiting for me. I turned onto the normal road that took me in the direction of the woods and sketchy neighborhood. I approached the same small hill where I had seen the lady at previously that day. I accelerated up the hill and made it to where I could see the downward slope of the hill, and I slammed on my brakes. To my shock, the lady I saw earlier was standing right at the bottom of the small hill and in the middle of the road. She was dressed in all white bedtime clothing and had an even more disturbing look on her face than she did the last time. She still had that lifeless face, but she was not frowning. I put my car in park, rolled down my window and asked, "Hey, are you okay?" There was a brief pause of silence for a few seconds. She just continued to stare at me. Then out of nowhere, she reaches into her left side pocket and throws an object in the direction of my window. I duck down, fearing it's a rock about to smash right through the glass. I hear a loud thud, but it's not the thud of a rock or hard object that could break glass. I look up, and to my horror, I see the head of a squirrel laying on top of my windshield wipers. I yell, "What the fuck, lady?" I quickly roll up my window and I see her now sprinting full speed towards my car. She makes it to the driver's side door and begins trying to open the door while banging on the glass. I get a closer look at her while turning my gear back to drive. Her clothes were filled with blood stains, and she had scars and cuts all over her arms. I floored it in the direction of my house, looking back to see her throw one last unknown object in my direction. I'll never know what that object was, but that was the last thing on my mind. I made it home and called the police. I didn't go back to the scene to see if they had found and arrested her, but about 2 hours later I got a visit from the police. They told me they found her on the side of the road where she had previously been, just sitting in the grass with no expression. Turns out she had been in some mental institution for 5 years over in Tennessee and had been released 6 months prior. The police told me they took her into custody and searched her home. They found something disturbing. Decapitated squirrels, chipmunks, and snakes scattered all throughout her house. The husky was in a cage unharmed though, thankfully. I'm glad she didn't harm any actual person, but I still feel for those animals. I hope she gets the treatment she needs, and that I never see her again. The following are true scary stories found on the subreddit Let's Not Meet. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and share it with your friends. Let's begin. It was the summer before my senior year in college. My little brother, always being interested in military stuff, had gotten a pair of night vision goggles for his birthday, and he left them at my apartment. One night I was bored and decided to go try out the goggles at a wooded hiking area / nature preserve nearby. In retrospect, this seems like a very stupid idea, since I was all by myself, and female. But I was young and stupid, and got myself all excited at the possibility of seeing deer and other woodland creatures in their natural nighttime habitat. I was familiar with these woods. My best friend and I had hiked in there at night before, and we'd never run into anyone else. Our area is mostly rural and pretty safe, so I didn't anticipate any trouble. I parked in the little sparsely lit parking area, ignored the sign that said park closes at 10, and entered the woods, night vision goggles in hand. It was a half moon that night, and that was the only light that filtered down through the canopy of trees. It was pretty dark, and I didn't want to put on the goggles until I had found a place to sit down, so I lit my way with my mini mag light on my keychain. A couple of times I thought I heard a little rustling in the woods a fair distance away, but it was nothing out of the ordinary, and I put it down to the animal activity, hopefully the deer I'd been hoping to see. After I'd hiked a fair distance, I found a fallen log to sit on and put on the goggles. I don't know if you've ever used night vision goggles before, but the effect is impressive. They can turn near pitch darkness into bright as day. Everything appears in shades of green, but quite bright and clear. For a while, I had a blast looking around from my fallen log vantage point. Some chipmunks played around in the leaves nearby. A big owl blinked its lamp-like eyes at me from a tree branch. No deer though, and I started to think that maybe they wouldn't be likely to come anywhere near me, darkness or no, if I sat right in the open on a log. So I decided to find a place where I could be a little more hidden. I made my way a little deeper into the woods and found a huge tree, perfect for climbing. I've always loved climbing trees, so it was nothing for me to hoist myself up a few branches and settle in to wait for my deer. I didn't get to see any. What I did see, lit up in bright night vision green, almost 10 minutes after waiting, was a man, dressed head to toe in dark clothing, making his way stealthily through the woods. He was coming from the same direction I'd come, and was clearly staying hidden, moving from tree to tree and glancing around carefully before moving on again. It looked very much like he was looking for someone. It took me a few moments to notice that he was carrying something, and when I saw it, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. He had a knife, a big one, and he was gripping it as if he expected to use it in the very near future. It wasn't deer hunting season, and this was a nature preserve, where hunting of any kind is prohibited. And at any rate, the guy was alone and not dressed as a hunter. There were no deer in sight, and very few hunters kill their prey with knives. I was suddenly horribly aware of my situation. A young woman alone, helpless, in the middle of the woods at night. This was the 90s, so no cell phones, and even if I'd had one, I wouldn't have felt safe using it lest I draw his attention. I don't know how he was able to see so well in the dark. I guess his eyes adjusted, and I was terrified he would look up and see me. I sat there, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, and watched him as he continued his methodical and stealthy process of scanning the forest for who or whatever the hell he was stalking. I scanned around, but couldn't see anyone else, even from my high vantage point, and the sickening thought struck me that he might be looking for me. I remembered the rustling noises I'd heard in the woods when I first arrived, and then I thought back further and remembered something else. A white car had followed too close behind me for most of my drive to the nature preserve. I'd been annoyed and a little freaked out at the time, but when I turned into the nature preserve parking area, the white car had just passed me and driven on its way, and I hadn't thought anything of it. Now I wondered, horrified, if this was the driver of that car. If he'd circled back and seen my car, parked alone in that lot. If he'd come in after me. I sat, paralyzed with fear, and watched the man for what felt like forever, but was probably another half hour or so. There was a heart-stopping moment when he paused right underneath my tree, and I was sure he was going to look up and find me. After a while, he seemed to give up on whatever plan he had in mind. I heard him say, "Fuck it," and he started heading back in the direction he'd come, the direction of the parking area. I stayed in the tree, wet with sweat and crying, until the sun came up a few hours later. Then I climbed down, still terrified, gripping the little can of pepper spray on my keychain. I made my way as fast as I could to the parking lot. The man had been there. My windshield had been smashed with a rock, and someone had scraped all down the sides of my car with something sharp, presumably a giant knife that I'm lucky didn't end up in my chest. Thank God for the night vision goggles that let me see him before he could see me, and thank God for big trees with sturdy branches. I did call the police once I got back home. 2 very nice cops came to my apartment and took a report, and that was unfortunately the last I had ever heard of it. I live alone out in the country with my 2 Caucasian shepherds. Caucasian shepherds are notoriously known as the best guard dog breed in the world, and when you live out in the country where the nearest neighbor is miles away, they are your best security system. One evening it was around 11, and Danzig and Ripley were monitoring the house. I was watching an older slasher flick that was on some channel I had never heard of. I began to feel pretty tired and decided to head to bed. Suddenly, I was woken up by Danzig and Ripley barking uncontrollably. I looked at the clock on my nightstand, 3:34 in the morning. I walked into the living room where Danzig and Ripley were still barking. They were facing the front door, and I decided to open it. Most of the time they had woken me with their howls, it was because there was some sort of animal outside. Outside I saw nothing, just an empty field of grass. I sighed in an annoyed manner and marched back to the comforts of my bed. Danzig and Ripley were just now quietly growling. Whatever animal was out there, it wasn't out there anymore. The next morning I got up and put Danzig and Ripley on their leashes. We walked through the grassy field and into the woods. In the woods there's a large path next to a small creek. As I was walking, I saw a figure hidden amongst the trees. It had a human shape. I wondered if it was just a lost person searching for help. "Hello?" I called out. The figure didn't move. "Are you lost?" The thing began to move through the trees until it was about a couple feet away. I saw a heavily bearded man. He was wearing a baggy hoodie that had many holes. The hood concealed his eyes. I said once again in a more quiet way, "Are you lost?" The man spoke. "I'm fine." His voice raspy and showing that he had little teeth left. those that still remained yellow and cavity-filled. He remained standing there a couple feet away. I knew he wouldn't come close, not when there were two large growling dogs at my sides. The man was creepy, but I wasn't intimidated or anxious. I said bye and continued on my walk. By the time I returned to the spot I had spoken to the man, he was nowhere in sight. I didn't think much of it and returned home. I stayed there until night playing Killing Floor on my PC. I eventually grew tired and went to bed again. Again, I woke up to the sounds of my dogs barking at the door. I walked into the living room and opened the door. As soon as I opened it, I saw a piece of paper on the ground. It was folded in half and I could barely see text through it. I picked it up and opened it. It was written in red ink and read, "I like your house." I immediately thought, "What the fuck?" and closed the door. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning I took Danzig and Ripley on their usual walk. I didn't spot the creep and thought nothing of it. When I returned to my house, a window had been broken. I rushed into my house with my dogs who were starting to go crazy. They started barking at the closet in the hallway where I kept my supplies. I opened it, and there stood the hooded man, hunched over holding a kitchen knife. Before he could even move, my dogs pounced on him. He dropped the knife and was now laying on the floor where my dogs were holding him down. I contacted the authorities and the man was arrested. It turns out the man was an ex-convict who had been in jail for heroin possession. He was sent to prison, but I still haven't completely gotten over it. Every time my dogs bark, my heart drops. I live in the south of the US, and what I mean by south, I mean redneck territory. If you've ever heard of the food livermush, then you'll get a specific picture of the area I live in. If you've never heard of it, then don't worry. The food is mainly in the south, kind of like grits. My mom works in a doctor's office dealing with medical records in another county. Sometimes I go to her office and sit with her if I have a doctor's appointment, or go to work with her when I'm wanting to meet up with friends who live in that county and hang out at their place. Around 4 years ago, my friend, Betsy, who lives in the county my mom works in, asked me to hang out. I rode with my mom to work to wait on my friend and sit with my mom until then. I decided to go outside for some fresh air and to walk around a little bit when a red truck pulls up and stops in front of me. I thought maybe he wanted directions, as often people do in the county, so I walked up a little bit, not too close, to the passenger window and asked him what he needed. As I'm walking up to the passenger window, I take in the physical characteristics of the man in the driver's seat. He looked to be in his 50s, short white hair, scruffy beard and a beer gut. He looked normal enough for the men around his age that lived in the area, so I didn't really think much of it. Before I can ask him what he needs, he asks me if I need a ride. After telling him no, that I'm waiting on a friend to come pick me up, he proceeds to tell me that he can take me anywhere if I need it. I back up a little, look at my phone as if I just got a text message, and tell him that that was my friend and they'll be here in a few minutes. About 5 minutes later, as I'm trying to calm myself down, he pulls back up. He then tells me that he has a job for me, and it pays a lot of money. He said that I look to be old enough for the job, and I can use the money to buy clothes and makeup and other teenage girl things. I tell him no thanks, and practically run back into the building. I look out the window, and the red truck is still there. I run to the back of the office and tell my mom everything that happened. She follows me to the window so I can show her the truck, but it has already sped off. By this time, her coworkers are calling the police and asking me for the details of the truck and the man driving it. As I'm giving the details, I see my friend pull up in the parking lot. I go out and meet her and tell her what happened. As we're leaving, I spot the red truck. I tell her that's the truck, and she speeds up to pass it. The next day I hear that the police caught the guy. Turns out he was a wanted sex offender and has many accounts of molesting and raping young girls, including his nieces. I'm thankful that I was smart enough not to get in the truck with him, because who knows what would have happened to me. My boyfriend, who I live with, works as a teacher in town about 15 minutes away by train. He gets home more or less at the same time every day, give or take an hour or two. I, on the other hand, work from home. In late January of this year, we'd gotten in a pretty big fight about something stupid. I can't even remember what it was about now, but it was one of those fights we didn't speak to each other, text, call, or anything the whole next day. So this afternoon I was lying in bed getting work done. It was Tuesday, and I was pretty sure his last class finished at 1 p.m. on Tuesdays, meaning he'd surely be home at 2:30. But around 1 p.m. I heard the front door open and shut. I thought, I guess he's home an hour early today. It was normal for him to skip his last class every once in a while, so I didn't really think anything of it. In fact, I was mostly mentally preparing for the awkward post-fight, "Hey, how's it going?" conversation. So I continued to lie in bed and do my work and wait for him to come in and change his clothes. The bedroom door was closed, and I had earplugs sort of half in, as I usually do when I'm working. But I could hear the heavy footsteps of him walking around the apartment, as he always does. If we hadn't been in mid-fight, and I wasn't so preoccupied with the awkwardness of it all, I might have noticed it strange how slow the footsteps were, or how long he spent walking around the living room. But I was caught up in the dramatics of the following nights is where things got weird. On this portion of the trail, you were supposed to camp on the trail or designated shelter. We didn't really want to run into other people, and didn't want anyone coming up on us in the middle of the night. We decided to ignore those suggestions and find our own little place off of the trail. A little searching around, and we found a spot a little ways off of the trail in the middle of a small clearing. It was perfect. We set up camp, cooked some food, talked a while, then snuggled up and went to sleep for the night. Somewhere around 2 a.m., I awoke to my girlfriend shaking me awake, telling me, "Get your gun, someone is outside walking around our tent." She informed me that she woke up to what sounded like someone right outside the tent, running a knife or something along the side while circling us. When hiking, I carry a 1911 and a Judge with me. You never know exactly what you might run into when on such a long hike in a remote location. I got the Judge out of my pack, and then we sat silently listening for any sounds. A few minutes of nothing but the breeze blowing through the trees, and then I heard it. Someone or something walking in the woods behind our tent. I got the flashlight and silently made my way out of the tent. Our fire had went out, so it was nearly pitch black. Illuminated by only the dim glow of the October moon, I told my girlfriend to stay put while I checked it out. I didn't flick the flashlight on right away, so as to not give away that I was out of my tent and have it become a shining beacon of my location. Instead, I waited to hear more noises. After a few minutes, it sounded like it was bipedal, based on the way the steps were paced. I turned on the flashlight and flooded the area with light. I thought I saw someone move behind a tree. I yelled out and told them to go away and that I was armed. I kept the light on the area with my gun drawn and slowly approached the area where I thought I saw the figure. Then, from my right, I hear what sounds like someone running through the woods. I spin and face my light that way, and then from the original spot, who or whatever was there takes off into the woods. There was no way I was giving chase, so I returned to the campsite. I tell my girlfriend about what happened, and I end up sitting guard outside the tent, in the darkness, until daybreak. In the morning, I looked around for a bit for signs of who or whatever it was, and I discovered a boot print in some soft moist dirt not far from our tent. It wasn't mine, and it wasn't my girl's. This freaked us out as it confirmed that someone, perhaps more than one, was skulking around our tent in the dark. I kept it to myself, because I didn't want to freak my girl out any more than she already was. At this point we were pretty deep in, and still had 2 days left. That day we walked a little faster than normal and covered as much ground as possible. When it came time to set up camp, I found a spot near a cliff where we could place our tent in a small overhang and prevent anyone from coming up behind us. The whole day up to this point, I had a feeling we were being followed. I had no confirmation of this, as I hadn't seen or heard anyone else, but it was just a gut feeling. We set up camp and made some food, then retreated to our tent. I gave my girl the 1911, and I kept the judge right next to me, and I assured her that if we slept at all, it would be with one eye open. After a while, she drifted off to sleep, and I stayed awake listening to the sounds of the woods at night. I was awake for a few hours, just waiting to see if anything was going to happen. At some point, I guess my exhaustion caught up with me, and I drifted off. I awoke sometime later to what sounded like something going through our stuff outside the tent. I grabbed my gun and woke up my girlfriend, shushing her to be quiet. From the faint glow of the fire, I could see someone's silhouette against the tent. There was really someone out there. I yelled out to them something along the lines of, "We're armed, get the fuck out of here." They dropped what they were doing and bolted. I came out of the tent, gun drawn and ready to shoot someone. Our stuff was strewn all about. They had rummaged through quite a bit of our stuff. I walked to the edge of the woods in the direction whoever was out there had fled in. There was a creek nearby that I walked to the edge of, where there was a small trail running alongside of it. Down the creek I could see a light. It looked like a lantern the way it flickered. Then I saw 3 more emerge from the other side of the woods. I told my girlfriend to start packing up whatever she could and that we were leaving, now. We packed up everything of value, left the tent and a few other items, and headed back onto the trail, in the middle of the night. I kept hearing people talking off in the woods and hearing branches snap for quite some ways. I kept looking behind us every few seconds to make sure nobody was coming up on us. It was completely nerve-wracking. If something happened, we were still a long ways from anywhere, and quite literally on our own, since we hadn't seen another hiker the entire time we'd been out there. I really felt that we were in serious danger. We had been walking for quite some time when I heard something in the woods behind us. As we rounded a corner, I turned around and saw something step up on the trail and just stand there watching us. It was just as the sun was coming up, and barely any light. I couldn't make out any features, just a silhouette. I stopped and looked at them for a second, and asked them who they were and what they wanted. They just stood there silently, watching us, and then turned and walked back into the woods. We picked up the pace and kept going, looking back every so often. We didn't see them again, but my gut told me that they were still there for quite a ways. We eventually reached the end of the trail, and we got to where we had parked my girlfriend's car, extremely exhausted. We made it out of the Virginia woods without becoming a meal for a clan of cannibalistic inbred hillbillies, which is what I pictured happening in my head the whole time. I have no idea who they were or what they wanted. Maybe it was just someone messing with us. Maybe it really was a clan of deformed hillbillies who were hunting us. I will never know, because I will not be returning to find out. My name is Claire, and I live in Ireland. My sister Sonia has always been my best friend. 3 years ago, Sonia came over to my place excitedly telling me about a date she had with a new guy at work named Eric. I was happy for her, as she had broken up with her abusive ex-boyfriend a few months earlier and was finally starting to enjoy life, as well as being an amazing mother to her little boy. As the next few weeks passed, Sonia and Eric had gone on a few dates, but it was nothing serious at all. All seemed to be going smoothly, until one night I got a call from Sonia. When I answered the phone, she was upset. She told me that she had been out with Eric and that she had went out to have a cigarette. A few moments later, he came out shouting at her, telling her she was taking too long and she must have been flirting with other guys. Then he called her a slut. I was shocked, and understandably so was Sonia. She said he just changed into a different person for no reason. She told me she was finished with him because she had already had an abusive relationship, and she wouldn't go down that road again. I agreed that that was the right thing to do. The following day, Sonia was bombarded with text from Eric, begging for forgiveness and another chance. She told him no way, and to leave her alone because she wouldn't accept being spoken to that way. But he wouldn't stop texting her. This went on for days, and Sonia repeatedly told him to leave her alone. One day, while Sonia and Eric were at work, Eric walked off the job. A while later, he texted Sonia saying he was in a hotel with a rope and he was going to hang himself. My sister was a very kind person, so this upset her, and she texted him back not to do it and to get help, and that he also shouldn't put his family through that pain of losing him. A few hours later, he texted back saying he couldn't do it, and he just needed to see her. She told him that she didn't want to meet up, but that he should get help. A few days later, Eric came back to work. Sonia told me that he kept staring at her, and it was freaking her out. When she got home from work, Eric texted her that there was a rumor going around work that he was stalking her. She replied that she hadn't heard about that rumor, but told him that he was freaking her out with the way he was always staring at her. Sonia told me she was going to ask to change shifts because he made her feel so uncomfortable. Over the next few days, Eric's texts became non-stop, telling Sonia that he needed to be with her and that she was cold-hearted for not being with him. She told him to just leave her alone and to move on, and that it wasn't normal to be acting this way after only a few dates. She then blocked him from Facebook and from her phone. We thought that would be the end of that, but we were so wrong. During the next 2 weeks, a guy named Shane added Sonia to Facebook. Their conversation started off friendly, but soon became flirty. She seemed to like Shane, so she arranged to meet him in a hotel for a bit of fun. Please don't judge my sister. She was a good person, and all adults do stuff at this point. I know meeting in a hotel is a bad decision for her to make, but nothing can ever change that now. On the 15th of February 2004, it was Sonia's son's 3rd birthday. We were all going to the play center to have a little party for him, and Sonia was going to meet Shane later that night while her son was at a sleepover at our mother's house. The day went great, and we all had fun. That night at around 9 p.m., Sonia checked into the hotel room where she was meeting Shane. He said he would be arriving a little later, as he had a few things to do, so Sonia just chilled in the hotel texting me. The last text I received from her was at 11:40 p.m. The next morning at 11, my mother called me asking if I'd heard from Sonia. She was supposed to collect her son, but my mother couldn't get a reply when she had called or texted. I tried to call her, but there was no answer. Hours passed and I thought she was just hungover in bed or something. Nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. My mother and I were sitting drinking tea together at around 4 p.m. when there was a knock at the door. "That must be Sonia," I said. We answered the door and were greeted by 2 policemen. Immediately, my stomach sank. They asked if they could come in, and of course we let them in. They told us that Sonia's body had been found dead on the hotel room floor and that she had been strangled to death. My mother and I sobbed uncontrollably. We just couldn't believe what we were hearing. My beautiful sister couldn't be dead. No way. We went to the hospital with the police, and to our absolute horror, it was true. Sonia was dead. The next few hours were just a blur. Later that night, a man handed himself into the police and admitted that he killed Sonia. It was fucking Eric. There never was a Shane. It was Eric the whole time. He had set up a fake Facebook page so he could lure Sonia to the hotel and murder her. He gave my gorgeous sister a horrifically brutal death, and we soon found out that he raped her too. Eric raped Sonia, and then he beat her up. She tried to fight back, so he strangled her. First, He tried to do it with her phone charger, but when that wasn't working, he used his hands to strangle her. He also shoved her top inside her mouth with such force that it broke her teeth and dislodged her retainer. This was to silence her, according to him. It took 3 years for the trial to begin. It was over within the last few weeks, actually. The sick bastard pleaded not guilty and claimed that he suffered from a mental illness. This makes me sick. He premeditated her murder. There is no question about that. For 2 weeks, my family and I had to sit in a court listening to the details of the horrific death Sonia suffered. But thank God he was found guilty of her murder. I'm writing this on the day of his sentencing, Friday the 26th of May, 2017. Eric was sentenced to life in prison for murdering my sister. I am glad he was convicted for making my amazing sister suffer and for leaving her son without a mother. I am now raising Sonia's son with my own children. He's 6 now, and I always tell him about his mother and how much she loved him. I would just like to warn everyone about the dangers of social media. Please be careful and don't meet anyone in hotels. If you're going to meet someone from social media, at least do it in a public place. This error in judgment cost Sonia her life. This is a photo of Sonia, taken the day she was murdered. I just want everyone to see the beautiful woman that scumbag stole from mine and my family's lives. I blocked out her son's face, for obvious reasons. The grief I feel from losing my sister is so overwhelming, even 3 years later. I'm just hoping one day it gets easier to cope with the pain. This memory of mine begins about 3 years ago, when I graduated high school. I had grown up with my grandparents, but decided to move to a different, and much larger, city to live with my dad for the first time in 12 years. I somewhat knew the city already, because I spent my summers with him, but this would be my first time I would have the freedom of an adult, to come and go as I pleased, drive my car anywhere, smoke cigarettes, whatever I wanted. I was excited, though sad to leave all of my friends. As soon as I settled in, my dad and stepmom sat down to discuss the new rules and what I needed to know about the complex. Basic things like, go wherever you want, but let us know when you leave and when you're coming back, even if it's 2 a.m. And you'll have to park on the street. And also, one more thing, there's the neighborhood creep. This guy, George, was well known by all the women in the complex, as well as the police that patrolled the area. I've always been a fan of these stories, and for a particular reason. I can oddly relate to many of them. I'm 20, and I think back on how many weird situations I've been in, and it's almost comedic irony because of how young I am. Yet, I've had what seems like a lifetime of creepy shit happen to me. But one of these situations sticks out the most. This story is completely true, and dates back to when I was a sophomore in high school, taking place in a suburb of Kansas City, Missouri. Me and my ex-girlfriend went to my high school football game on a Friday evening in September of 2013. We left a little early at about 9:30 because there was a showing of a movie we both wanted to see, and our football team was way ahead in score, so we thought we wouldn't miss anything. We pretty much won already. I just recently got a vehicle as I turned 16 that August, and while it wasn't extravagant, I was happy with it. While driving to our local AMC theater, you have to pass about 10 to 15 minutes of nothing but fields and trees, a small community college that I currently attend, and a few houses. While driving through the empty stretch, we both noticed my radio was cutting out and my lights were turning on and off. Eventually, my lights turned off completely, so we couldn't see anything while driving, and I was fairly sure my truck was about to break down. We decided to call it quits on the movie and do a U-turn and attempt to drive home through the empty stretch. While driving, my vehicle slowed down and shut off completely, so I pulled off to the side of the road. To my right was an empty field outlined by a few trees, and to my left there were 2 warehouses with a few lights around them. I was starting to stress out about how much money it would cost for a new battery or alternator for my truck, as I was fairly sure either one of those were the culprit for my truck breaking down. And I had parents who made me pay for my own shit. I knew financially I was on my own for this one. I attempted to call my family for help, and no one answered. Strange, I thought. My girlfriend was kind of freaked out because no one was answering, and while this empty stretch is very pretty during the day, it was damn creepy at night. Fog is very heavy in the fall and spring months due to a decent-sized river that resides in the area. I have to admit, for the creepy scenery and what was about to happen, I really wasn't as creeped out as I should have been. About 10 minutes pass, and nothing, until a car speeding down the same road we were on quickly stops, the tires screeching. It was a police car. The cop opens his door and put one foot out with the radio in his hand asking, "Have you guys seen a woman around here? She's dark hair, kinda small." Me and my girlfriend look at each other like, what the fuck? We both said the obvious no, as this area was fairly secluded, especially at night. Right after we responded, the cop said something in the radio and quickly sped off. This dude was in a hurry. Me and my girlfriend were getting a little anxious. The cop didn't even ask us if we were alright or offer us any assistance. This was really strange. But as my financial woes popped back into my head, I focused on my truck for a bit and how I would be able to afford the repairs. Then, literally 3 to 4 minutes later, I see something to my left that I'll definitely remember for a long time. A frail woman with greasy long hair, wearing nothing but a gown. The way she walked was extremely creepy. Her left hand was contorted and she was twitching as she walked. I wasn't really processing what I was seeing until I noticed her gripping something in her right hand. Then I quietly asked my girlfriend, "Do you see that?" She responded with a yes, and we said nothing else. We just cautiously watched this woman walk across the corresponding road within 50 yards away, with the most fucked up expressions on our faces. This woman didn't seem to even notice us. She was just staring blankly in front of her, and continued that creepy walk. She eventually disappeared down the road and was out of sight. I honestly just brushed this off and continued to get in touch with my brother, whom I did, and was now driving to give us a jump start. We get my truck up and going again, and instead of going straight home, we decide to go to my uncle's house because he has a diagnostic machine, and we wanted to know exactly what happened with my truck. While on the way to my uncle's house, we had to go down the corresponding road, the same direction the woman went. While driving down the road, I didn't even think about what I had seen. Again, I was just worried about being able to afford parts. We then are on the same road, except this road is even more desolate. There is nothing but trees for miles on each side. While driving for about 15 through 20 minutes down the road, I see something to my right side. It was the same woman I saw before. She stopped in front of my headlights and then proceeded to turn around. I got a look at her face, and she was pretty terrifying. She looked like she was methed out, and was an older woman with tons of wrinkles with a blank stare. I looked to my right, and my girlfriend just looked at me really weirdly and said, "Fuck this," and gave me a half-hearted nervous laugh. Despite us being creeped out, we again didn't think much of this. It wasn't resonating like it was supposed to. We both were too far caught up in getting my truck fixed. I make it to my uncle's house. Turns out it was my alternator, and he told me to be sure to not shut my vehicle off until I made it home, and I would make it there fine. Me and my girlfriend get home, and it's about 1:30 a.m. We both sat on my bed, and I kind of nonchalantly brought up the cop and the woman and everything that had happened. It both hit us very quickly, and we were like, holy fuck, that was seriously something out of a horror movie. Then, something really weird came up. This part is actually one of the things that creeps me out the most. Where we saw her walking the first time, she was a good 3-hour walk from where we saw her next, and it was maybe an hour and a half after the first time we had seen her, at most. Seriously. Not only that, but the way she walked definitely wasn't fast. She was twitching all over the place and seemed like she had a slight limp to her. We both were wondering how she got there so quickly. We also both concluded that the cop driving by us and the creepy woman walking by had to be related. A coincidence like this is almost non-existent. One takeaway from this story is to be aware of your surroundings. No matter what may be on your mind at the time, it's pretty safe to be aware. This night could have gone south quick, and we truly didn't recognize that to the extent I should have. I am a 25-year-old male. This happened to me when I was about 12 years old, when on a week-long fishing trip with my family. I grew up in a small town called Two Rivers, Alaska, about 50 miles south of the Arctic Circle. I use the word town loosely because it was a 15 or so mile stretch of road in the middle of the woods, about an hour north of Fairbanks, the closest town, with dirt roads and houses branching out along the road in the middle of a hilly and heavily wooded area. We had a single gas station, a laundromat, a cafe, and an elementary school. K through 8th grade with about 50 kids attending any given year. I mention all this because based on this lifestyle, I was relatively ignorant of how bad people could be. Though my parents tried to explain this a little bit to me and shared tips to prevent being targeted by creeps. Don't talk to strangers. Always walk with your back straight, chest out and eyes forward to look less vulnerable. And if anyone ever tries to kidnap you, kick, scratch, claw, and scream as loud as you can. I took this advice seriously, though I never thought I would actually find myself in a situation like this, so I became complacent. When this took place, it was the middle of summer in June. I remember because it was Father's Day. The fact that it was Father's Day becomes relevant later. Summer in Alaska means 24 hours of daylight. The sun is high in the sky all day and night. The darkest it gets is when the sun gets low enough that it hides behind a hill, though the sky remains blue, and the weather is always mild and pleasant. In contrast to winter, when we get 3 hours of daylight a day, and it's negative 40 degrees. Myself, my mother and father, and my two brothers, 11 and 7, and my 11-year-old cousin, went for a week-long fishing excursion down in southern Alaska. Southern Alaska is absolutely beautiful, with lush green forests and huge mountains. God's country. If you go down south enough, it becomes a literal rainforest. We drove about 200 miles south to an area called the Russian River. One of the intimidating things about Alaska is that you can drive hundreds of miles in any direction and not see a sign of civilization. It's just vast, beautiful, untouched, and pristine wilderness. The last frontier. We arrived at the river around 3 in the afternoon and immediately set off to catch some salmon. We parked the camper in this parking lot / camping area on a hill and set up our tents. We then hiked down this trail through the woods that zigzags down the face of the hill, similar to a goat trail, but with railings. From the tip of the hill you can hear the babbling river and can see parts of it through the gaps in the trees. But as soon as you begin walking down, you are immediately engulfed in thick vegetation and tall, thick trees, spruce and birch primarily. When we arrive at the bottom, there are combat fishers everywhere. For those who don't know, combat fishing is close quarters, shoulder-to-shoulder fishing. People up and down the river fighting over the same fish. Sometimes if you snag one, a person will actually grab your line, cut it, and run off with your fish. And there can often be fistfights over fish in spots along the river. When people see someone with a fish on, crowds of people begin to stampede to that area in an attempt to catch one themselves, or see if they can get the opportunity to steal it. It's weirdly intense for what would otherwise be a relaxing activity. We find our spots that aren't too crowded, feed our lines, attach our lures, and begin fishing. On my side of the river is a small gravel bar, a slight incline, and the main trail mostly covered in a thin tree line where people can walk up and down the river, then thick vegetation going up the hill where the camps are located. On the opposite side, a steep embankment and more thick wilderness. No trail, no camping spots, nothing. Just hundreds and hundreds of square miles of forest on the other side of this river. A few hours pass, and no luck for anyone, not even a nibble. We hear the occasional shouting of, "Fish on!" and then the sound of dozens of feet stomping through the water towards the voice. We can see the fish everywhere, but still not so much as a nibble. It was about 8 p.m. now, and everyone had given up by this point and decided to call it a night. However, it was Father's Day, and I was determined to catch a fish for my father as a present. I was on my own, but there were still quite a few people around scattered up and down the river. Still not having much luck, I picked up my net and pole and moved a little further down the river, in hopes that being further away from the main crowds I'd have all the fish that managed to get through all to myself. However, I was a little wary of being too far from people because every so often I'd hear some rustling and crunching in the woods across the other side of the river. And in southern Alaska, there is a dense population of grizzly bears, so I make it a point to make sure that there are at least some people around me, just in case a bear decided to come lumbering through and get in on some combat fishing too. Grizzlies, though huge, are often just as afraid of us as we are of them, unless Spooked, she has a cub, or we are in the way of their food, which most of us were, here in the river. I'm slowly wading through the river, attempting to just snag a salmon in my net at this point, having had shit luck with my rod. Now I'm so focused on my goal that I didn't realize that it's 1 a.m. Since the sun never set, I had lost all track of time. I had been down in the river for hours. The other thing I hadn't noticed was that I was concentrating so hard on catching a fish for my dad, I had wandered away from everyone. I look up and down the river, and there is absolutely no one in sight. Not even the distant sound of talking, walking through the water, or the sound of lines being cast. The only thing I hear is the babbling of the quick-moving water all around me as I'm wading in the middle of the river. I begin to feel anxious and uncomfortable, which is unusual because I grew up in these woods. I begin to get tunnel vision and concentrate on any sound that might come over the sound of the water. I hear nothing until a rustle and the cliche as hell snap of a twig. Any experienced woodman would tell you, the only thing that snaps twigs in the American wilderness are bears and people. What was worse was the sound came from in front of me, up the embankment on the opposite side of the river, where no one should be. I looked up the embankment on the opposite end of the river, about 25 feet from me, and I see a blonde tuft of hair in the bush. I stare at it for a few seconds, not entirely sure of what I'm seeing, nervous as shit that it's a bear, until the hair begins to rise. And so does the hair on my neck as I see that it's a middle-aged man standing from a crouched position, obviously hiding, trying not to be seen. I would rather it have been a bear. Wouldn't be the first time I've run into one. He has bright curly blonde hair, pale skin, a beer gut, and a bright pink hoodie, which seems odd for someone to be wearing in the middle of the Alaskan woods. He's staring at me, and I'm looking back at him. "Hey there, boy," he said in a gargled, rough voice, partially drowned out by the sound of the river. "Hey," I said back nervously, but trying not to sound it. "I see you have a net there. I could really use that. All I have is a pole." "It's my dad's," I said back. "Where is he? You shouldn't be all alone out here. Lots of bears around here. Come with me. I have a secret fishing hole just up the side of the river through the trees a bit. There are a lot of fish we can both catch together. We can take turns using your net." Yeah, go fuck yourself, I'm thinking. I'm not a moron. "There's a small maintenance bridge just down the river," he says. I keep looking at him. The thick forest on either side starts to feel more like tall, foreboding walls, trapping me in here with no other soul in sight. Just me and this man. "Meet me there," he said suddenly and sternly. Me being the shy and self-conscious type I am, I stuttered and just said, "All right." He backs into the tree line, where I can barely see him, and begins watching me as he walks down river. I had said okay, in hopes that he would just walk away without looking back at me. But since he was, I slowly started making my way towards the bridge. I'm not stupid. I know this isn't right. He was obviously trying to remain unseen before I spotted him. How long had he been following me? Skulking through the woods, watching me, waiting for me to wander off by myself. There should have been no one on that side of the river. and I haven't seen anyone on that side all day. He's still walking just ahead of me on the other side of the river, looking back from time to time to make sure that I was still coming. He turns away, and I immediately bend down and pretend to tie my shoe. I'd look up and wait until the first second that he's out of sight. I do a 180 and begin walking back the opposite direction, looking for someone, anyone, so it wouldn't just be me and this freak. I look back, and my heart sinks into my stomach. That terrible tingling feeling in my stomach. Like butterflies, but the butterflies all suffer from severe anxiety. I see the man standing in the middle of the bridge, staring right dead at me, seemingly peering into my soul. I can't quite see his face, but I can sense his intense agitation. I don't know why this creeped me out so much, but he raises his hand and begins waving at me. I turn away and keep walking, feeling his gaze drill right into me. Finally, I see a couple just at the bend of the river. I jog and get up close to them, and I continue to fish, still determined to get my dad a fish for Father's Day. I should have just said screw it and made the walk back to camp. But no, I continued to fish. The crowds of people are severely thinned out at this point. Lots of distance between the few remaining people, and the occasional couple holding hands walking down the trail or along the river. Then, it happened again. I got too damn focused on what I was doing that I hadn't noticed, yet again, I was all by myself. I am a fucking idiot. I didn't notice right away because I was too enthralled in fishing, concentrating on where the fish are located and where I should dip my net since the bending light through the water is misleading where the fish actually are. But my almost trance-like state was suddenly broken by the loud thunderous sound of someone stomping and charging through the water, getting closer to me. My first thought was, fuck, bear. I look up and see a flash of pink and blonde. It's the man, and again, I would have rather it been a damn bear. I feel a hard pressure on my arm, and I feel the collar of my shirt getting yanked up, choking me. I thought you were going to share your net, he says, oddly calm, but at the same time I can hear and feel the predatory aggression in his voice. I'm being dragged through the water towards the other side of the river. I can't keep my footing, and I can't pull away from his grip. I knew I should scream. I needed to scream. In my head, I desperately wanted to scream, but I was frozen and confused. It just happened so fast I was still trying to process it, yet it felt like it was all happening in slow motion at the same time. It felt like it wasn't really happening. Even if I had tried to scream, I was being choked with my shirt to the point that it burned, and I didn't think anyone would hear me over the rumbling river. I just went limp, playing fucking dead, blankly staring off. I still don't know why that's all I did. My secret spot is just over there, you little shit. You will love it, I promise. There are tons of fish for us, he says, with an increasingly aggressive tone. No one will find it. The tight grip on my arm began to ache, yet I was still clinging to the fishing net and fishing rod. I remembered just staring at the sky. The edge of my vision was circled by the tips of the trees. The sky was a very dull blue and white. No clouds in the sky. I don't know why this visual stands out so prominently in my memory, but it does. Hey, bear. I hear this lightly echoed through the river. Hey, bear.